On the night of 31st May 2009, Air France Flight 447, an Airbus A330 was cruising from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, carrying 228 passengers and crew. The journey, expected to be routine, would soon turn into one of the deadliest aviation disasters in modern history. The flight began smoothly, with the aircraft climbing to its cruising altitude over the Atlantic Ocean. The night sky was clear in Brazil, but as the plane approached the equatorial regions of the Atlantic, the weather conditions started to change. Violent thunderstorms were reported in the area, with towering cumulonimbus clouds and intense turbulence. The cockpit crew, consisting of an experienced captain and two co-pilots, was well trained for routine operations, but this particular flight faced a combination of challenges that would test even the most skilled pilots. As the aircraft entered the storm zone, the pitot tubes, which measure airspeed, began to freeze due to ice crystals. These sensors are critical for providing accurate speed readings to the flight control systems. Within moments, the autopilot disengaged because of conflicting speed data, forcing the pilots to manually control the plane in extremely turbulent conditions. Confusion quickly spread in the cockpit. The co-pilots were trying to interpret the sudden alarms and the unreliable instruments while maintaining the plane's altitude. In such high-stress moments, every second counts. The aircraft began to climb sharply, a reaction to the perceived low airspeed, but in reality, it was gaining dangerous altitude with decreasing airspeed. The stall warning sounded repeatedly, a signal that the aircraft was no longer generating enough lift to maintain flight. In the dark night, surrounded by violent weather, the pilots were forced to rely on their training and instincts, but the overwhelming combination of faulty instruments and severe turbulence made every decision critical. As Flight 447 struggled to maintain control, the pilots faced an alarming situation. The aircraft had entered a high-altitude aerodynamic storm. In simple terms, the wings were no longer producing enough lift to keep the plane flying. The stall warning continued to blare intermittently, adding to the confusion in the cockpit. The co-pilots, now fully in control while the captain rested in the cockpit, attempted to follow standard recovery procedures. Normally, pilots are trained to push the nose of the aircraft down to regain airspeed and lift, but in the darkness above the Atlantic, reacting to conflicting instrument readings, they mistakenly pulled the nose higher, worsening the storm. Inside the cabin, passengers were unaware of the immediate danger. Some were sleeping, others were watching in-flight entertainment, completely oblivious to the invisible struggle occurring miles above the stormy ocean. Turbulence shook the plane violently. Flight attendants held on to secure themselves while performing safety checks, but there was nothing they could do to influence the flight's trajectory. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, frustration and stress mounted. The co-pilots had to make split-second decisions based on incomplete and unreliable information. The aircraft's flight computers, which normally manage autopilot functions, were no longer assisting due to the frozen pitot tubes, leaving the pilots fully responsible for manual control. At around 2:10 a.m. local time, the plane was over one of the most remote stretches of the Atlantic Ocean. The altitude fluctuated dramatically, from 35,000 feet to nearly 38,000 feet, creating extreme stress on the aircraft structure. Every second mattered. The co-pilots tried to stabilize the plane, but the combination of human error, instrument failure, and severe weather created an unstoppable chain of events. The stall persisted, and the plane's descent began to accelerate. With each passing moment, the chances of recovery decreased, as the aircraft lost more and more altitude. As the minutes ticked by, Flight 447's situation grew increasingly dire. The pilots were still struggling to understand the conflicting information from the instruments, and their repeated attempts to recover the aircraft were unsuccessful. The stall warnings continued, accompanied by alarms and automated messages from the flight systems, creating sensory overload. In such a high-stress environment, even minor misjudgments can have catastrophic consequences. The aircraft's nose remained high, which is exactly the opposite of what was needed to escape the stall, causing airspeed to drop dangerously low. The co-pilots attempted to communicate with air traffic control, but the remote location over the South Atlantic made consistent radio contact nearly impossible. Every transmission was delayed or unclear, offering little guidance. Meanwhile, the plane continued to oscillate violently, pitching up and down, rolling slightly as it fought against gravity and turbulence. The storm below was relentless, with lightning flashes briefly illuminating the wings and the ocean beneath, while thunder and wind battered the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's attention was completely consumed by trying to keep the plane in controlled flight. They had to constantly monitor pitch, airspeed, and altitude while fighting natural human instinct, which was telling them to pull back on the controls as the plane felt like it was dropping. Unfortunately, this instinctual reaction actually worsened the stall condition. The Airbus A330, designed to handle such situations when controlled correctly, was now trapped in a deadly cycle. The higher the nose, the slower the airspeed, the more critical the stall became. Meanwhile, the cabin remained in relative calm compared to the chaos in the cockpit. Passengers felt sudden drops and turbulence, but had no idea that the plane was in a full stall, potentially descending hundreds of feet per minute. Some began to notice the unusual motion and slight panic began to ripple, but there was no clear way to communicate the imminent danger. In these terrifying moments, the cockpit became a battlefield of human error, mechanical failure, and unforgiving natural forces, all converging over the vast and empty Atlantic. At this stage, Flight 447 was trapped in a high-altitude stall that lasted far longer than any pilot could have anticipated. Every maneuver made by the co-pilots only prolonged the stall, and the plane's descent became increasingly erratic. The vertical speed fluctuated rapidly, sometimes dropping thousands of feet per minute before briefly stabilizing. The stress on the aircraft's airframe grew, though it remained structurally intact at this point. The pilots were desperate, trying to regain control with limited visibility and unreliable instrumentation. The freezing conditions at 35,000 feet caused additional challenges. Ice accumulation on critical sensors had rendered the autopilot ineffective, and manual control was now the only option. In the confined cockpit, fatigue began to set in despite the adrenaline rush. The captain, who had returned from his rest period, immediately assessed the situation. His experience was extensive, but even he faced a nearly impossible scenario, correcting the aircraft's attitude in severe turbulence while countering the effects of frozen instruments and human error. Every action had to be precise. Any mistake could accelerate the descent into disaster. As the aircraft continued to fall, the combination of low airspeed, high altitude, and stall created an unstable aerodynamic environment. The pilots attempted multiple corrections, pulling the plane up to maintain altitude while trying to push forward enough to regain lift. However, in this delicate balance, physics offered no mercy. With each oscillation, the aircraft lost precious altitude, and the margin for error narrowed to mere seconds. The autopilot could no longer intervene, and the warning systems only added to the overwhelming sensory input, creating confusion and panic inside the cockpit. Below, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly, dark and unforgiving. There was no hope for immediate rescue if the plane were to crash. The pilot's training dictated precise recovery steps, but the reality of the moment, the chaos, conflicting data, and physical exhaustion made execution nearly impossible. Every second was critical, yet every attempt at recovery seemed to edge the aircraft closer to disaster rather than away from it. The story of Flight 447 was no longer just about mechanical failure, it had become a tragic interplay of human limitations, technological shortcomings, and the raw forces of nature. As the minutes passed, Flight 447 continued its relentless descent through the turbulent night sky. The aircraft, though built to withstand extreme conditions, was now in a situation where physics was against it. The wings struggled to maintain lift at the high angle of attack, and the engines were operating under conditions far from optimal. The pilot's repeated attempts to push the nose down slightly to regain speed were counteracted by their instinct to keep the plane climbing. This tragic misunderstanding of the stall situation prolonged the inevitable. Inside the cockpit, the tension was palpable. The captain was now fully engaged, instructing the co-pilots and trying to take control. He analyzed the limited data available, while the co-pilots frantically manipulated the controls. The aircraft's instruments, affected by the frozen pitot tubes, continued to give unreliable speed readings. Every time the pilots attempted to stabilize the plane, alarms blared, further escalating stress. This high-pressure environment tested their training to its absolute limits, revealing how even the most experienced aviators can struggle when multiple systems fail simultaneously. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers began to notice the abnormal movements more distinctly. Drinks spilled, luggage shifted, and the turbulence became almost unbearable. Some passengers tried to look outside, but the night was pitch black, with only occasional lightning flashes illuminating the clouds. There was no indication of what was happening above them, the chaos was confined to the cockpit, invisible to those on board. Flight attendants, trained to handle emergencies, continued their safety checks, but there was nothing they could do to influence the aircraft's trajectory. The combination of human error, mechanical limitations, and extreme weather had created a catastrophic scenario. Each oscillation in altitude and pitch increased the stress on the pilot's decision-making and the aircraft's structure. Flight 447 had become a textbook example of how multiple failures, each manageable on its own, can align to produce a deadly outcome. The plane's descent became more pronounced, with altitude dropping rapidly as the storm above the Atlantic continued to rage without mercy. As Flight 447 plunged through the storm, the aircraft reached a critical point. The aerodynamic stall persisted, and the pilot's repeated attempts to recover were having limited effect. At 35,000 feet, the thin air and high altitude made every maneuver less effective. The plane's nose remained dangerously high relative to the airflow, preventing the wings from generating sufficient lift. With each oscillation, the aircraft lost more speed, and the margin for recovery shrank. The co-pilots, exhausted and tense, tried to rely on training, yet the chaotic environment made textbook procedures difficult to apply. The captain, now fully present, gave urgent commands, but the human instinct to pull up in response to the feeling of falling continued to conflict with proper stall recovery techniques. The frozen pitot tubes and erratic speed readings meant that their senses and instruments were sending contradictory information. In such moments, confusion can become deadly, even for the most experienced crew. Inside the cabin, the passengers and crew felt the effects of the turbulence more severely. The plane's sudden drops and jolts caused panic among those who were awake. Seat belts held some steady, but unsecured items flew across the cabin. In the darkness of night, passengers had no idea the aircraft was in a full stall over one of the most remote parts of the Atlantic. The storm, relentless and unforgiving, added a layer of terror that could neither be predicted nor controlled. Meanwhile, the aircraft's flight systems, designed to aid recovery, were offline due to the frozen sensors. The A330's sophisticated computer systems could no longer intervene automatically, leaving the pilots solely responsible for maintaining control in a near-impossible scenario. Every attempt to adjust pitch or speed seemed to trigger new alarms, creating sensory overload and delaying crucial decisions. The combination of environmental stressors, mechanical failure, and human response was pushing the aircraft steadily toward disaster. By this point, Flight 447 had been struggling for over 10 minutes in a near-continuous stall. The aircraft, now losing thousands of feet of altitude per minute, had become a ticking time bomb in the sky. The pilots continued to fight the plane, but every maneuver seemed to worsen the situation. The co-pilots were physically and mentally exhausted, and even the captain's experience could not overcome the compounded effects of mechanical failure, extreme weather, and human error. The aircraft's vertical speed fluctuated wildly. Sometimes the descent slowed for a brief moment, giving hope, but each time the plane climbed slightly, it only intensified the stall. The engines, although powerful, were now operating inefficiently due to the high angle of attack, reducing thrust when it was needed most. Each movement of the control stick was critical, yet the feedback from the instruments was unreliable, making precise adjustments nearly impossible. In the cabin, the turbulence intensified. Passengers were gripped by fear, with some screaming as the plane pitched violently. Flight attendants struggled to remain upright, bracing against sudden drops and lateral jolts. The atmosphere inside the plane reflected a terrifying chaos, but none of them could have imagined the full extent of the danger looming above. The storm outside, with its towering clouds and relentless winds, provided no mercy, only the harsh reality of nature's unpredictability. The situation in the cockpit had become desperate. The pilots' repeated attempts to stabilize the aircraft failed. They were trapped in a cycle where instinct and procedure clashed, and the plane remained at a dangerously high nose-up angle. The stall was unrelenting, and the altitude continued to bleed away over the vast, empty Atlantic. Every second counted, but the relentless forces of nature and the limitations of both human and machine were proving insurmountable. Flight 447 was now teetering on the edge of an irreversible descent, with tragedy looming ever closer. As Flight 447 continued its uncontrolled descent, the situation became increasingly critical. The aircraft's altitude dropped faster than ever, and the pitch remained dangerously high, keeping the plane in a full aerodynamic stall. Each attempt to regain control was met with limited success, as the combination of frozen instruments, pilot stress, and severe weather created nearly insurmountable obstacles. The Airbus A330, designed for safety and reliability, was now a victim of circumstances that no automated system or training could fully compensate for. The pilots were aware that time was slipping away. The stall warnings continued to blare, a constant reminder of the aircraft's precarious position. In these final moments, they attempted every maneuver in their training manual, but human instinct often overrode calculated control. Pulling up to counter the feeling of falling, they inadvertently kept the plane in a stalled state. The intricate balance required to recover from such a situation at night over a remote ocean, with no visual references, was beyond the capacity of even the most skilled aviators. Inside the cabin, fear escalated as passengers felt the violent oscillations. Some passengers clung desperately to their seats, while others tried to understand the terrifying situation. Drinks, food trays, and personal items flew across the cabin. Flight attendants attempted to comfort those who were awake, but the reality was impossible to change. Outside, lightning occasionally lit up the dark, turbulent sky, revealing glimpses of the storm that had trapped the aircraft in its deadly grasp. With the aircraft now descending at an alarming rate, the pilots faced a harsh reality: the stall could not be corrected in time. The combination of extreme altitude, low airspeed, and the unrelenting storm had trapped Flight 447 in a downward spiral. The plane, despite the best efforts of its crew, was becoming increasingly vulnerable to structural stress. Every second brought it closer to the ocean below, and the magnitude of the impending tragedy was undeniable. The final minutes of Flight 447 were a harrowing battle against gravity and the unforgiving storm. The plane continued its descent over the dark, empty expanse of the South Atlantic, losing thousands of feet per minute. The pilots fought tirelessly, trying to pull the aircraft out of the stall, but the combination of human limitations, faulty instruments, and extreme weather proved impossible to overcome. Every maneuver to stabilize the plane only prolonged the inevitable. Inside the cockpit, the tension was unbearable. Alarms sounded continuously, demanding immediate attention. The pilot's training instructed them to push the nose down to regain airspeed, yet instinct and the terrifying sensation of falling repeatedly caused the plane to remain in a high nose-up attitude. Their mental and physical exhaustion added to the difficulty, and despite their expertise, the aircraft's situation worsened with each passing second. In the cabin, the passengers experienced the violent reality of the stall. Some clutched their seats in fear, others held on to loved ones, hoping for some form of reassurance. The turbulence shook the plane violently, and the storm's relentless winds and lightning flashes created an eerie, chaotic environment. Nobody on board fully realized the severity of the aerodynamic stall or the helplessness of the pilot's struggle. As Flight 447 approached the ocean, the speed of descent increased dramatically. The plane's fuselage, wings, and control surfaces were stressed to their limits, creaking under the forces acting upon them. With no successful recovery in sight, the pilots' valiant efforts were slowly being overwhelmed by the physics of flight and the relentless natural elements. In these final moments, Flight 447 became a tragic example of how multiple failures, mechanical, human, and environmental, can converge into an unavoidable catastrophe. As Flight 447 neared the ocean surface, the final moments unfolded with grim inevitability. The plane, still in a full aerodynamic stall, had lost nearly all of its altitude, and the structural stress on the airframe was extreme. The pilots, despite their tireless efforts and expertise, could no longer influence the aircraft's trajectory. Every warning alarm, every instrument reading, and every frantic adjustment had led to the same devastating outcome. At 2:14 a.m. local time, over 3 hours after departure from Rio de Janeiro, Flight 447 collided with the South Atlantic Ocean. The impact was catastrophic, shattering the fuselage and scattering debris across the remote waters. All 228 passengers and crew on board perished instantly. The vast, dark ocean swallowed the remains of the aircraft, leaving no immediate trace for rescuers. The tragedy of Flight 447 would not only haunt families and colleagues but also send shockwaves through the aviation industry worldwide. Investigations revealed a complex web of factors: frozen pitot tubes causing unreliable airspeed readings, a high-altitude stall that the pilots could not recover from, and the overwhelming stress and confusion in the cockpit. This disaster became a landmark case in aviation safety, leading to improvements in pilot training, better understanding of high-altitude stalls, and technological upgrades to prevent sensor failures. Flight 447 remains a solemn reminder of the delicate balance between human skill, technology, and nature. It stands as a testament to the bravery of the pilots who fought valiantly in impossible conditions and as a lesson for the aviation industry to continuously adapt and improve. The Atlantic keeps its secrets, but the story of Flight 447 endures, a tragic but vital chapter in modern aviation history.